Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. On today's episode, I want to share with you the art of self-definition, the art of identity, as one of the 5 components of self-differentiation. A lot of big words here. But if you slow them down, self-definition, you're going to define who the self is. You're going to identify the identity. And we are talking about self-differentiation that helps you know who you are, who you're not, where you end and other people begin. In the previous 2 episodes, I shared with you an overview of self-differentiation. And what self-differentiation does is it begins with a clear sense of this self-definition or your identity. And so last week on episode number 93, I shared how awareness, the A in the acrostic of ART, the A of ART, A-R-T, is awareness. Awareness of your own historical story, how it has evolved into your present emotional processes. Awareness is the first step to having an emotionally healthy sense of self. This is your identity. So we gave you exercises to build the muscles around awareness. So let's review the concept first of the overarching self-differentiation. It is the ability to define, hold on to, and regulate one's own beliefs, values, goals, and emotional states in the midst of surrounding togetherness and even under pressure. So again, let's consider it this way. It's the ability. So there is capacity, there's competency, skills that can be developed. The ability to define what your beliefs are. To be able to enter into self-differentiation, a precursor is you must be able to define what your beliefs are, define what your values are, define what your goals are, to define what your emotional states are, and be able to hold on to those beliefs, those values, goals, and emotional states, and then to emotionally regulate, even in the midst of surrounding togetherness, where there are people around you, family members, co-workers, team members, bosses, employees, people who direct report to you, all of that, and the pressure that the togetherness can bring, that you have the ability to define, to hold on to, and regulate your own beliefs, values, goals, and emotional states in the midst of that while you're staying connected to them. And so it is this understanding that there's always pressure to conform to any system. Whether that's a family system, a congregational system, a corporation, a nonprofit organization. And so the creator of family systems theory, this is a therapeutic model that was developed by Dr. Murray Bowen. And in his website, he describes self-differentiation as the following. It's the degree of resilience, the degree of resilience to the interpersonal contagion of anxiety. So anytime you have more than one person in an environment, you're going to have this interpersonal opportunity to transfer or to have a contagion of anxiety. You pull a group together and it can jump from one person to the next person. So the definition that Bowen gives is the degree of resilience to the interpersonal contagion of anxiety in a relationship system, and how well and how mature we handle anxiety in our relationship systems. Now, when Dr. Bowen talks about anxiety, he's not talking about a person who traditionally thinks of living in a panicked state. He's talking about any emotional dysregulation. He's talking about anything that's causing a person to be in distress. And interestingly enough, in all maladaptive behavior, at the very root of it, you're going to find anxiety. Anxiety that is rising up And in that anxiety, there's the need for control. The need for control causes a person to get into this kind of panic, and the loss or the threat of losing survival and the threat of losing belonging is going to cause a person to act in ways, even on a nervous system level, that later they're like, what the heck? What was that all about? When Dr. Bowen talks about self-differentiation, he goes on, and this is on his website, he says, the less developed a person's self, or your self-definition, or your identity, the more impact others have on your functioning, and the more the outside person, someone outside of you, tries to control actively or passively the functioning of others. If this is you, you're the one doing this. The basic building blocks of a self are inborn. But in individuals' family relationships during childhood and adolescence, they're primarily going to determine how much self that we actually end up developing. Once established, the level of self rarely changes unless a person makes a structured long-term effort to change it, unless we become intentional to change it. And in fact, just simply surfacing our awareness of this is giving us an advantage to begin maturing in differentiation. And you can't mature in differentiation until you mature in your sense of self, or your self-definition, or your identity. Bowen says this: people with a poorly differentiated self depend so heavily on the acceptance and approval of others that they either quickly adjust what they think, say, and do to please others, or they dogmatically proclaim what others should be like and pressure them to conform. Now, if we were all in the same room, maybe I'd ask for a show of hands. How many of you do that or have done that in your family, the family maybe that you lead? Or how many of you have done it in a marriage? How many of you have done it when you get into a professional environment, maybe a church, a congregation, a business environment, a team that you're in? All of these are environments for which anxiety, again, has spread around, and you see the players in the room actually expressing that anxiety in these ways that we're describing. And the only healthy way to be able to lead the team or be a team member that has a calming presence is to be calm, is to be able to regulate the emotions and be able to bring healthy process into the group. My friend, Pastor Steve Cuss, he's the author of a great book. I encourage you to get it, called Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. I love the title, Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. And he describes differentiation like this: differentiation is the ability to be fully yourself while being fully connected to people. I've said this on previous episodes that for me, my weakness is that whenever I feel betrayal or rejection, I tend to lose the connection to people. And differentiation is not just simply being able to define who you are as separate. It is being able to know who you are, hold on to who you are, and still be fully connected to people. Cuss goes on to say, it is gaining clarity on where I end and the other begins. A differentiated person allows space between herself and another, even when that other person is highly anxious and asking for a rescue. A differentiated leader is clear on her own values and conviction, is not easily swayed from them. And the opposites on either side of differentiation are important to look at. For instance, the opposites are enmeshment or detachment. Enmeshment or detachment. An enmeshed leader is unable to hold any space between himself and the other. And if the other is struggling, the enmeshed leader gets pulled right into it. The detached leader holds too much space between himself and the other, and there is so much space the leader does not care for the other. That would be more of my own tendencies in leadership. Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode. An enmeshed leader struggles with codependency but calls it empathy. I'm going to repeat that. An enmeshed leader struggles with codependency but calls it empathy. I'm just an empathic. I'm just a person of empathy. But the detached, that was the enmeshed. The detached leader struggles with indifference and thinks it's healthy. I don't care what anybody thinks. Well, that's not the healthiest approach to life either. It's important to be able to hold on to yourself, clearly define who you are, self-definition, and to be able to have an identity that you're not letting go of, you're not abdicating, you're not compromising, but at the same time staying connected to other people. And so, in contrast, a differentiated leader is fully present but fully intact, with space between where he or she ends and the other begins. Cuss says this: a differentiated leader offers non-anxious presence. A differentiated leader offers non-anxious presence. An enmeshed leader, on the other hand, offers anxious presence. A detached leader offers non-anxious absence. Let me hit those 3 again. These are powerful statements when you begin to explore who you are as a leader and how you apply leadership in environments. The differentiated leader is simply a non-anxious presence. In other words, there's no anxiety whenever the differentiated leader walks into a space or a room, and is able to bring a calming presence to the team, to the group, to the family. An enmeshed leader, this is a fused leader, offers anxious presence. So when this leader comes in, is reflecting the energy of everyone in the room, is feeling higher levels of panic, something rising up even on a subconscious level, and as a result, the room continues to grow in anxiety, even when the team members aren't aware of all the spinning that's happening below their surfaces. So a differentiated leader brings the non-anxious presence. An enmeshed leader brings an anxious presence. Those make sense. But the detached leader offers non-anxious absence, is there to work logistics, but doesn't have connection emotionally with the team, the family, or the people. So regardless of the group being a nuclear family, staffed employees, a missions group, or a congregation, if it is a group of people, it becomes a dynamic system, and each person is affecting the other and the whole. I love how Steve Cuss talks about some of this around the family systems theory, and this is what he says: if you can learn some of the family systems theory, you can lead in an entirely different gear than you're leading in now. You'll not neglect content, and these are big words now. You'll not neglect content or what is being said, but you'll add the ability to pay attention to process, how people are relating, and perhaps the most powerfully, how they're affecting your own anxiety. 2 big words within systems theory. It is noticing the difference between content and emotional process. What we typically do as leaders, many of us have a default, and it is our protection mechanisms that if we have the right content, if we're structured right, if we have the right rules, if we have the right policies, if we have all of the right structures around us, then we have right content. So whenever somebody disputes something in our leadership or the organization or the family, we have a tendency to go with justice on the content. And what we end up doing is putting process way below the surface, and most of the time never even address the emotional process. Well, in differentiation and the ability to have self-definition and identity, we begin with the emotional process. We begin to watch the room. We begin to watch relationships for their emotional processing, and we don't elevate the content to be the priority of what is happening in the moment. We begin to scan for anxiety. We scan for the energy that's being brought to us. And so, again, when you think of content, it's what's being said. When you think of process, you're talking about how the people are processing emotion and how they are relating to each other and actually affecting anxiety, not only in you, but in the whole room. Things like who's quiet all the time? Who's quiet? And the question that we would ask is why? Why are they quiet? Who takes all the energy in the room? Who needs the last word? Who is passive aggressive? Who always has a meeting after the meeting? Who acts different depending on who is in the room? And most powerfully, what or who is stuck in a predictable pattern? So maturity is about becoming solid in your own sense of self, your own identity. The more mature you are at differentiation, the more mature you are as a human, expressing the maturity in all relationship systems. So in short, the same reality that we experience in family systems, we're also going to experience in church systems, business systems, military systems, friend systems, etc. So we're looking at the 5 components of this self-differentiation work. And in these 5 components, we created an acrostic. It's the ARTSY, A-R-T-S-Y. The first 3 of ARTSY, the ART, A-R-T, is self-definition. This is identity in self-differentiation. And it is a precursor. You can't differentiate to others unless you have a clearly defined sense of self. And so the A is awareness. This is mindfulness. It's the emotional state inventory. It's knowing your family history. It's knowing where you came from. It's knowing what has evolved or forged the emotional processes from your family of origin to losses and griefs and injuries, to know what triggers you, etc. Spent an entire episode on awareness last episode. But then the R in self-definition, the R in ART is responsibility. And we'll be talking about that today. It's where you have limits. It's where you're defining who you are and who you're not. And then the T in the ART of self-definition is transparent truth. This is what's true of you. It's you being honest and transparent. It's you being available and showing up. It's having a clarity on your beliefs. So those 3, A-R-T, is about self-definition. The ART-C, the C-S-Y, is about self-regulation, and it is where you stand up, you show up, you have courage to actually be who you are. And then the last is Y, and that's you. It's hold on to you. It's hold the line. It's stay the course. It's the radical acceptance of who you are. So today, we want to look at the next component of maturing in self-differentiation, and it's to take intentional responsibility. It's the R of ART, the R of ART, to take intentional responsibility for who you are and who you're not, what you want, what you don't want, what you believe, and what you don't believe. This is the R in the art of self-definition, the art of identity. And again, they transpose both in what we're talking about with self-definition and identity. Also, it transposes into ultimately in self-differentiation. So you can also think of self-differentiation as taking responsibility for the management of your own anxiety and the reactivity and issues. Differentiation is actually a training process. It helps a person disengage trying to change other people to trying to change themselves. Now, as a leader, that sounds like, well, isn't that contradiction? I thought as a leader, we're supposed to lead people to change. There's a big difference in leading people to change and then forcing, pressuring them to change. Anytime you are forcing somebody, you're disempowering them and putting them into a victim's emotional state, and that causes a person to be stuck. When they have freedom to choose to stay, to choose to go, to choose to do, to choose to not do. Now, as a leader, if a team member decides that they're not going to participate in the things that you're leading, then you have to have heart-to-heart conversations. You want to empower their choice, but the power of their choice may be that they don't fit in the organization any longer. The point being is you want to stay connected, even in that process, to help them find a spot that helps them prosper and enjoy everything in life.
Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry. You won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more.
When we talk about this idea of responsibility, individual and intentional responsibility, this is one of the most clear concepts throughout biblical scripture. In Ezekiel 18:20, the prophet says this, "The soul who sins shall die." And then it clarifies, "The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." And so we see the individual responsibility, that I'm responsible for me, I'm not responsible for others. Now, I may have a certain responsibility to provide, but I'm not responsible for the emotional state of another person. I'm not responsible for what another person reacts or how a person carries their anxiety. I'm responsible for me. I'm responsible for my roles. I'm responsible for what God has given me. I'm responsible for being a husband, a dad. I'm responsible to be a leader or a pastor of an organization. I am responsible for certain roles that I activate and live in, but I'm not responsible for other people and how they experience it, what they want to experience. Now, I can get feedback. I can hear what they're saying, but still, I am not responsible for the anxiety that's driving their lives. I'm not responsible for how they are emotionally processing whatever's happening in the organization. I am responsible to stay connected while I hold on to self and do what's best for the organization. Well, again, these scriptures, there's many of them, but the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 14, this is the Amplified Version, verse 12 and 13, "And so each of us shall give an account of himself," give an answer in reference to the judgment to God. We each, every one of us, individually, we're going to give an account of himself. I'm not going to give an account about somebody else. I'm not going to give an account to you, about you. I'm going to give an account of myself to God. And then he goes on, "Then let us no more." It's so cool. "Let us no more criticize and blame and pass judgment on one another." Why? Because I am not responsible for the other person. My criticism is anxiety surfacing to the very top and then driving me to try to control another person, try to control how they act, who they are, what they do. I am not any longer going to criticize or blame, even blame. Now, blame here has to do with how anxiety comes up in us, and we have to shift that responsibility of carrying the anxiety. We have to allow someone else to mitigate it for us, so we blame somebody. Now, keep in mind, whenever there is logistics going on, job descriptions and roles, there are responsibilities within those roles that have to happen. And yes, we do have a responsibility to hold those accountable. And in the context of who is responsible and how was the outcome to the execution, and we have to go in and coach and tweak and even hold accountable too. But blame here is a reference to that when somebody is living their lives in a particular way and anxiety is driving them, we're not now going to look that we have to give an account for them. We're going to no longer criticize, blame, pass judgment on one another, but rather decide and endeavor to never put a stumbling block or an obstacle or a hindrance in the way of a brother or sister. The idea is that we are here to serve. We're here to teach. We're here to have compassion, which compassion is an opposite of anxiety. Compassion or love is actually what reduces the anxiety in the room. So perfect love will cast out fear. So when we are talking about the responsibility and teamwork, what we're doing is we're saying, I'm giving an account to the Lord. I'm not going to control other people's anxieties. I'm not going to look at their distresses and somehow engage or become codependent or feel like that it's my responsibility to calm them or to answer them or to fix them. My responsibility is to do what it says. I'm not going to put a stumbling block. I'm not going to be an obstacle. I'm not going to be a hindrance. But what I will do in bearing the burdens of another person, I can bear the burden as in from a differentiated self, knowing where I end and where they begin. I can zoom out, see them, love them, care for them, and yet still not be the one responsible for their outcome. That's critical. If I get sucked in to feel the need to be responsible for their outcome, I guarantee I'll criticize, blame, pass judgment, and so on. The Apostle Paul goes on in another text and says in Ephesians 4:31, let all bitterness, trauma, grief, and loss. So bitterness here is not just that I'm living a bitter life. It is that I have engaged the emotional trauma, the grief, and the loss that has now then created reactivity around me. And Paul says, let all bitterness, let this trauma, grief, and loss, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor. And when he talks about clamor, it is wailing distresses. It's drama. It's when people carry drama into circles of systems. Family systems, corporation systems, congregational systems, all of these relationship systems. And again, he says, let the bitterness, let all the trauma, the grief, and the loss, let the wrath, let the anger, the clamor, which is this wailing distress and drama, let the evil speaking be put away from you. The fact that he begins with let it all means that it's your responsibility to deal with it. Now, this isn't behaviorism. When you look at the entirety of Scripture, it is dealing with what's going on in the heart. Jesus came to address the heart. He told the Pharisees that your whitewashed sepulchres full of dead men's bones. There's something about the way Jesus would approach things, say it's not enough just to have behavior. We're looking down in the heart. What's the heart? The heart is the part of you that has been wounded and injured, and you have adapted to be able to manage your family of origins anxieties. When you're in your 1 year age stage, just in that first year, your amygdala, the part of your brain that emotes, is scanning with your eyes. There is a nerve called the vagus nerve, and so much data is going through your eyes in your ears in that first year, and it is informing the amygdala, and it's how do I adapt for survival and belonging with this mother, with this father, with these siblings? How's mom relating to dad? What kind of anxiety is there? All the nonverbals are coming to the surface. And so you have grown in your heart. You've grown in your soul. You've grown in your brain. to actually mitigate or to adapt around everyone around you. So this is talking about let all bitterness enter into a process of wholeness, enter into a heart process, a soul process, a brain process to recover. And so he says, let it all be put away from you. With all malice. The word malice is a word that means ill will or to cause trouble. In other words, put all this stuff away from you with the ill will or the causing of trouble. So as Christians, as followers of Christ, we are people who aren't stirring the pot. We're not only not bringing our anxiety and drama into a space, we're actually not going to stir the trouble. We're not going to cause the trouble, stir the pot. And then he goes on and says, be kind. Be kind. Why? Because kindness releases inside of your brain oxytocin. And when oxytocin is released, which is a biochemical, it's a neurochemical that goes into the amygdala, and it begins to calm the release of cortisol, and cortisol is the stress hormone. It is the way that people get activated to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so what we do is we be kind, but we're kind not out of anxiety. This is an important distinction. We're kind out of a compassion for the other person. Our motivation isn't, I'm compassionate because it's going to make me feel better. Our motivation is, I'm compassionate because I care about who you are and the distress that you're in. Be kind to one another. By doing that, it actually creates for us a calm. And he goes on to say, tenderhearted. Be tenderhearted. You ever notice that if you're filled with bitterness, wrath, anger, you're in wailing distress and trauma, you're evil speaking, that you can't retain a tender heart? Your heart becomes walled up. It's armored. And in that armor, there is hardness. And he goes on to say, forgive one another, even as Christ forgave you.
How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you will do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details.
As we look through Scripture, we see things like Adam and Eve. And when Adam and Eve took of the forbidden fruit, God comes walking in the cool of the day, and he says, Adam, where are you? Adam eventually comes forward, and he says, who told you you were naked? And how did this happen? And Adam blames Eve. In fact, blames God and Eve. He says, in response to God, he says, the woman you gave me. So the woman, casting blame, that you God, casting blame, gave me. What we're seeing here is a dodge, a denial of responsibility and a dodging of that responsibility, shifting blame on somebody else. At the very beginning, the very first statement in the process of repair, we have Adam deciding that, oh no, it's not my fault. And by refusing responsibility, you lose a sense of self. You lose your self-definition. You lose your sense of identity. This is critical. And when people today are shifting blame to everyone on the outside. They're the reason that I'm angry. They're the reason that I am afraid. They're the reason that I have no hope. They're the reason I'm depressed. All of these, you made me so mad. Listen, nobody makes you so mad. Nobody. Being made so mad means that you have fused with them, that you're not differentiated, and the fact that you're not differentiated means that we got to go back to the art of self-definition and find out where you fell apart. Are you unaware of what the emotional spinning is inside of you? Are you unaware of how the patterns of your family of origin and actually your generational genome, your tree, how that has affected who you are today? If you're unaware of that, that could be a fragile part of your foundation. Also, responsibility. If you are not taking intentional responsibility for your own emotions, then in fact, you know that your identity is, again, extremely weak. It is fragile. So Adam blames Eve, the woman you gave me. And then Eve blamed the serpent. The serpent deceived me. It's just this denial of responsibility. I like how Seth Godin says it. He's the best-selling author of leadership books, and he says, it may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. It may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. I think that systems theory really embodies this in a nutshell. Systems theory is not very interested in blaming somebody, either in the present day or even in those historical wounds that came from your family of origin. Systems theory is very interested in helping you as an individual figure out who I am, how my story contributed to who and where I am, so I can more fully understand and take responsibility for my life, so I can be an empowered person in everything I do rather than living as a victim. It's in this space that I can ask myself in present challenges, what can I do about this situation? Again, when I'm able to take responsibility, I'm able to ask myself, I may not like my options. I don't like option A. I don't like option B. I don't like option C. I don't like option D. I don't like my options. But what can I do about this situation? What would be the wisest way to move out of this? How do I live differentiated and move forward to human health and flourishing? You know, when clients learn these concepts, they tend to first try to find someone to fix. In other words, immediately we begin looking outside of ourselves. One more time. However, this is going to be something that we have to constantly reinforce. It's really not about other people. All you can do is change how you are going to show up. Systems theory teaches if you change how you show up, it's going to force change in the entire dynamic, both in the group and each individual in the group. And I got to say, that is incredibly freeing. When we look at our historical stories, how our souls and brains adapted to the anxiety and distresses in our family of origin, we learn that things aren't our fault. Where we are today, things aren't our fault. That there are reasons why we are the way we are. However, it is our fault if we stay there. So knowing how multi-generational transmission, which is a big word in family systems, knowing how multi-generational transmission, the extending up your family generational tree, how that you look through your tree and you see these things coming down. Scripture would say that the family curse, the things that are happening in families, they go down to the third and fourth generation. When we look at that and knowing how it has built circuits of anxiety, it affirms that it's not your fault, which really relieves our personal shame. But now then, we have to show up and know in our identity, it's our responsibility now to say, well, I know this about me now. I know why I tend to do what I do, and I should do now something about it. So intentional responsibility is stepping in to do something about it. So self-awareness, the thing that we talked about last week, it's the A in the art of self-definition or identity, and this is absolutely critical. When we're self-aware, we look at our generational impact. We look at all that's happened throughout the generations, and then we look at our family of origin. We see how we adapted, and we, in our brains and in our hearts and souls, we began to relate to other people so that we could survive and belong. So self-awareness, the A in the art of self-definition and identity, is absolutely critical. However, it's a big however, to stop as self-awareness or to know your story but not take responsibility for your present and future will turn you into an entitled, self-absorbed, and toxic person. I'm going to let you breathe on that. To stop at self-awareness, just to know that your story is not your fault, but not to take responsibility for your present and future, turns you into an entitled, self-absorbed, and toxic person. Self-awareness without responsibility is a huge thing right now in our culture. It's not helping anybody. This person who's self-aware but won't take responsibility never gets to transformation. They're always expecting someone outside them to rescue them. And so they put anxiety in other people to get them to take responsibility for me. And so this person never gets to transformation. They actually never know their true self, their true identity. And I really believe this is what Jesus invites us into by dying to self, taking up the cross to follow him. It is learning where we came from, but then intentionally growing. This is what it means to be hidden in Christ, to learn how Christ's redemption intersects with our self-awareness. And this is why I believe God never speaks to us about aspiring to flawlessness and perfectionism. Although this clearly is what Christians typically think, that God is OCD, obsessive compulsive disordered, around rules and policies and laws and etc. No, what God is doing is simply showing you what is a standard of health. What is health? And we aspire to health.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
The biblical model is not flawlessness and perfectionism. Nowhere in Scripture is it that. Even the words perfect throughout Scripture are not relevant in terms of how we apply perfectionism today. perfect in the Bible is about growing and maturing. When people think about flawlessness and perfection today, they are using it to be a false guard, an armor, a protection mechanism, that if I'm just flawless and perfect, my life will no longer have such dynamite explosions of anxiety within me, that I know I've earned the right to survive and belong. And we all know that no matter how flawless or perfect you are, none of that answers it. It just doesn't. And so the Bible, God, constantly is reinforcing our growth mindset. And the growth mindset begins with responsibility. The Apostle Peter says, grow in grace and in the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. He doesn't say be flawless in it. He says grow in it. Grow in it implies you are imperfect. In fact, everything in the Bible implies you're imperfect and flawed. Even when he talks about renewing your mind, that you are to bring your body and your soul before the Lord, and that we are to renew our minds so that we can be transformed. Transformed by the renewing of the mind. Romans chapter 12, 1 through 3. When he talks about it, he's implying your mind needs renewed. And if your mind is the immaterial energy that is of a spiritual context, a soulish reality, if your mind is the energy that you're going to renew, understand it's your responsibility to grow. And it's the implication that you are not transformed already. You're not flawless. And that's why you're transformed. Transformation does not mean you're transformed into flawlessness. It means that you're transformed in the grace of God. You're growing in grace. Grace, again, is God's power. Jesus said it this way. It's his power made perfect in human weakness. You don't need to grow in grace if, in fact, you have already arrived at perfection and flawlessness. So you grow. Peter says it like this, like newborn infants, long for the spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation. So yes, we're saved by the work of Christ. It is a gift. We don't earn it. But then we grow in the salvation that we've been given. Most people think that God wouldn't love me because I've sinned so much, he won't even save me. Then they come to faith in Christ, and then they start all over with a brand new cycle of performance. And they think, I've now then got to be morally flawless. I can't be in any way imperfect. If I do, I'm going to disgust God. He loves me, but he doesn't like me. I just want to say, God in his omniscience knows everything about you. He loves you. He likes you. He gets you. And he's in a good mood to you. God is not waiting for the moments in real time for you to make a misstep before he's like, oh, I'm disappointed. Because he's omniscient. He knows it perfectly from eternity past. He knows the day that we're going to do unhealthy things, sinful things. And yes, sinful things are an affront to God. But that's because God is completely holy, which is completely healthy. There is no flaw in him, and he knows every sin will destroy the objects of his love, which is you. So the issue for God is not that you keep rules. The issue for God is that you are the object of his affection. He loves you. Sin will kill you, destroy you. So God hates with a passion sin. It is everything that is misaligned with what is healthy and right and in God's own nature. The Apostle Paul tells his mentee Timothy, he says to practice these things. Why would you practice these things? You would practice them because you don't have good muscle memory or because you're not flawless or perfected in them in terms of you have performed in an absolutely pure, excellent way. He says practice these things. Immerse yourself in them. This is all about maturity. It's about growth, the growth mindset. He tells him, practice them, immerse yourself in them. And then watch this, so that all may see your progress. The progress. It is about progress. So growth, not perfection, is our responsibility. Quit looking at your life as though all of the emotional things that are happening in you, you have a meltdown. Most people that I have as clients will default to, I just screwed up again, as though they are now beating themselves. In fact, words like, I just want to kick myself. I just want you to know God is not interested in your flawlessness. He's interested in your growth, in your intentional responsibility to say, I am responsible for doing the exercises, or as Paul told Timothy, the practices. I'm going to immerse myself in them so that in the responsibility, I can grow and I can be a more healthy person than I have ever known before. So when we talk about this, one of the great leadership writers is Edwin Friedman. He wrote the best-selling leadership book, Failure of Nerve, and he would say about self-differentiation, it is knowing where you end and where another begins. It then activates our sense of responsibility for ourselves. This activates our sense of responsibility for ourselves. So this is all about taking responsibility for ourselves, not taking responsibility for anybody else. So even in a team, even in an organization, I'm not responsible for everybody else. I'm responsible for me. Now, again, in an organization, in a flow chart, people have job descriptions. So there is a necessity to look at outcomes. And this has to do with whether a person's natural or physical skill sets, whether their competencies can actually execute on what their job description is. What happens, though, is that we get fused with the emotional anxiety behind all of that. And we take on, we become codependent, we absorb the other person's anxiety. And so what we have to do is say, wait a minute, I'm not responsible for all the emotion going on in somebody. I'm going to be a person of compassion and love and kindness. And yet at the same time, I'm going to be true to myself, my role, and I'm going to help others rise up. But if they can't rise up, I'm going to help them. I'm going to coach them. I'm going to tweak them. And if they can't do it based on what their job description is, then I do have responsibility to love them enough to help them move to a place that they can thrive. Otherwise, they're going to be demoralized every day. And for them, the beginning of recovery, of health, of fitting into a place that they can really thrive is to be self-differentiated. For them not to carry their responsibility into their boss. And how many people hate their place of work and they really own the distress that their bosses bring into the teams and the organization? And they'll be like, my boss is a piece of work. Well, that may be true, but I'm curious how much anxiety you're reflecting back simply because you're fused with your boss or a coworker. So it is focusing, this differentiation and taking responsibility. It's focusing on being able to define yourself and not define others. While you respect the rights of others, you don't let them intrude upon your own rights. So this is a healthy balance between knowing that other people have the right to believe what they want to believe, but at the same time, they can't force you to change what you believe. You can be open-minded, you can listen, you can engage, but you don't allow others to define you in the same way that you don't define others. This is the healthiest way to engage relationships. And an important point about this is that this comes from within you rather than being adaptive, rather than allowing others to define you. And one way to think about this is that it is intrinsic. This is who you are. It's what you believe. Not from being the object of other people's definition. You're not being defined by others. This means that even though we may try to please others, in certain cases, we do this out of a choice to serve, and it's from a place of empowerment. This is a big distinction. We don't do this to help define ourselves. We don't do what other people desire of us so that we can feel better about ourselves. And we're not looking for the affirmation from others to make ourselves feel good. We have that affirmation and security coming from within us. We know it's true of us because God says it's so. This is for a person of Christian faith, of course. When we think about the great commandment in the Bible, one of the things that we're called to do is to love our neighbor. But we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. The great commandment says that we're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then second commandment, greatest, is to love our neighbor as ourselves. Notice that we have to love ourselves in an appropriate, healthy way before we love our neighbors well. And we assume, based on that because we love ourselves first, we can't really love others well in a healthy way until we love ourselves well. And yet, what I notice is that many people struggle to feel okay with themselves, not because they believe God doesn't love them, but because they won't leverage God's love and authority in their life in definition. They won't leverage that to love themselves well. And they end up waiting for other people and even achievements, successes, etc., to validate whether or not they have the right or now permission to love themselves well.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com. That is REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival.
When we talk about this difference between a victim's mindset and taking responsibility, we're actually talking about empowerment. I love Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's the neuroscientist at Stanford University. He speaks about this idea of intentional responsibility by contrasting the pro-depressive circuits in the brain to what he ends up calling dopamine circuits, or what I can now call empowerment circuits, or we can say, in this context today, responsibility circuits. And when he talks about these pro-depressive circuits in the brain, it's the biochemical activity that moves us to depressed states. And again, he contrasts these pro-depressive circuits to intentional responsibility, to empowerment. And again, he labels them as dopamine circuits. So this is what Huberman says. There is a punishment signal, literally a chemical punishment signal, whereby dopamine, which is the feel-good molecule that is essentially for things like a growth mindset, focus, solutions, orientation, the pursuit of goals, and the well-being of all kinds of sorts, that this actual dopamine circuit becomes suppressed. Huberman actually goes on and describes how dopamine activity, again, this feel-good productivity chemical that helps us execute on life and to actually enjoy life, that it's more about the pursuit of a goal or the pursuit of a solution to a problem. It's more about the pursuit. It's more about taking responsibility for where you are and where you're going than it is about the actual outcome of the engaged strategy to that end. I want to clarify that. A lot of people think they will get dopamine if they achieve something, if they accomplish something, if they have an outcome. What Huberman is saying is that in neuroscience, as we study the brain, that there is a biochemical reaction that just by taking responsibility for where you're at and where you're going and saying, I'm not a victim to life any longer, I'm now in a knowledge base. I understand some things I didn't understand before, and I'm going to now take the best strategy I can put together, and I'm going to do something to move forward. I'm going to move out. Now, what's crazy is it doesn't even matter what your strategy is in terms of how effective it is. You're going to experience the biochemical dopamine reaction. You're going to experience the activity of dopamine, this feel-good productivity chemical. You're going to experience that simply by taking responsibility to move forward. So when you are sitting and you're feeling these spikes of anxiety and panic, and you're expressing it in ways of leadership dysfunction, what you don't want to do is blame everyone around you. If you begin to blame, if you begin to criticize, the scripture just talked about, if you begin to put it external, that they're responsible for my emotional state, you will actually get into a pro-depressive experience. In other words, your brain is going to come around you and reinforce, it's crazy, it's going to reinforce for you to stay stuck in your pro-depressive state, and it's now dependent on other people to rescue you out of it. And even at their best efforts, it often does not make a difference. However, when you step into this empowerment dopamine circuit of I am going to take responsibility, intentionally take responsibility for where I'm at, my emotions and what's going on, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to see awareness, what's happening in me. I'm going to look at the dots. So I'm going to collect the dots of my life. I'm going to connect the dots of my life, and I'm going to correct the dots of my life. When I begin to do that, all of a sudden, I'm going to have this dopamine release, which gives me focus. It then gives me the energy to do what it is that is the strategy. And before long, I'm beginning to feel this intersection of what's called dopamine and as a biochemical and epinephrine. And this is adrenaline. It's a multiplier. And then I begin to feel like life is amazing. And the outcome of my strategy hasn't even happened. And even when the outcome happens, if it is an outcome that's less than what I intended, the next thing I do is I re-establish a new strategy, and I begin to take intentional responsibility and move forward. Now, here's what's crazy. Here's what I love, is that when you do this, Huberman goes on and talks about that it actually reinforces the circuit and makes it stronger for your future actions. So even if you don't achieve the goal, but you are doing your best, you're sincere, you're authentic about pursuing the strategy of managing your emotions and even pursuing certain dreams that you have. If you'll just continue to build a strategy, and rather than sit around bemoaning, wailing, stepping into drama and saying my husband doesn't do what he's supposed to, my kids don't do what they are supposed to, my boss doesn't do what he's supposed to, my team members don't do what they're supposed to, and just drama, clamor, that rather than do that, you say, oh, I want to do that, but that's a false rescue. It's a false relief. So I'm now going to look inward, and I'm going to say, I'm going to take responsibility for where I'm at. When you take responsibility, it amazes me how much your body, God designed your body, your brain. Even I believe in spiritual energy, in your soul and in your mind, there is a surge of energy as you align with how God talks to us about taking intentional responsibility for our life. And it changes everything. It changes everything. Well, I want to address now for a few minutes, what would be some exercises? How do you build this muscle of taking responsibility? Well, I think the first thing is be aware that you have to take responsibility. That is absolutely fundamentally the first and most important, is that you become aware that you have to take responsibility. Then you ask yourself, what am I responsible for? What am I responsible for? You know, sometimes it's hard because we have so much emotional adjustments and adaptations that have happened in our pursuit of survival and belonging that we don't see ourselves well. And so when we see problems in front of us, sometimes we deal with static to be able to have a sober mind for strategy of what we're responsible for, even assessing a situation. So sometimes it's good to zoom out of your life, zoom out of your moment, and then begin to ask yourself, if I was counseling someone else, if I was helping someone else. And one of the most profound ways to do this is say, if I were counseling a child who was in the same scenario. And I realize that if you're, a CEO or a pastor, you think there's no child that could do this. But if you can take the principles down to a child level and think of an exact child, maybe it's your child, maybe if you're older, you have a grandchild or someone in the church that you just have, a real protection feel around, and then begin to think, what if they were to bring me this question of what I'm responsible for? And they were to ask you, what would you make them responsible for? I find it incredibly helpful to see, again, a child can be very helpful because it simplifies everything. But even if you look at a peer, a friend, somebody you're close to, and if you were counseling them, what would you say to them if it was their pain, their stress, their anxiety? How would you coach them? And so you, again, begin with this idea of what am I responsible for? And what am I going to carry? And what am I not going to carry? One of the examples of using an alternate friend or thinking of a child, I was in my certification process and I was hanging out in the class doing an exercise with one of my colleagues. And this particular person is a brilliant therapist, and he's one of the smartest, most articulate people that I have ever been around. And as we were just processing a worksheet, he began to share how that his mom and dad had gotten divorced, and his mom began to get in relationships with other men, and it was a committed relationship. But she got this one man, and they ended up, mom and my friend, moving into their home, and he's a little boy. And when they got into the home, the attic, there was an attic, go up some stairs, and in the attic, when you go into the attic, it was filled with pornography magazines and videos and so on. And so as a little boy of around, I think he was 8-ish, he goes up and he discovers these magazines. And of course, the biochemical reaction in a little boy's brain, it literally creates a damage. It skews because of the intensity of those neurochemicals, and it's confusing. It feels repulsive and at the same time extraordinarily attractive, and it's conflicting, and it feels immoral, but it feels so stimulating. It's just amazing, and yet it's just confusing. He experienced that. So as we're working through this worksheet, we come to the place of asking who was responsible. Where was responsibility in this scenario? And this fully trained therapist, this extraordinary, articulate, gifted, competent therapist, he said, well, I have responsibility in it. I shouldn't have gone up and discovered it, and I shouldn't have returned. And I said, can I challenge that? I said, if you had a client come into your office who's an 8-year-old, and it's just you and the 8-year-old, and he told you that exact same story, would you tell him he is guilty and responsible? Or would you have an emotional surge about the mom and this stepdad, but they're not married, this individual, that you would have a surge of putting them into a reality, a sober idea of what they have done to this kid? They victimized the kid. And he said, there's no question. I wouldn't put any of the guilt and responsibility on that boy. And I said, isn't it interesting? And this for me became a real insight, that sometimes we can't see our stories well, but we can see the stories of other people. And it becomes so much clearer because when we see their story, we don't have our historical past coming forward with skewed templates and filters to see the world. So one exercise is just to ask, what am I responsible for? And then imagine yourself coaching or counseling someone else about what they're responsible for. And what you're doing is you're just building this instinct of what I'm responsible for and how I can take intentional responsibility. A few other exercises real quick is to even ask yourself that. What exercise or solution can I use to address distressing moments? What this does is it just makes you much more kind of hyper aware of surroundings. So when you're on the internet and you're looking for stuff, or you do a Google search on exercises to grow in responsibility, accountability, etc., you can be looking for things. It just makes you aware. So when something is a good exercise that comes along, you can adopt it. One of the things you can do as an exercise is to identify, go back into your story and identify scenarios and of where you had responsibility denial, where you should have taken responsibility, but you dodged it. You blamed, you criticized, you somehow gave a profile characterization of a boss or a coworker, and you began to dodge the responsibility you have for your own anxiety. And then look for themes. Identify those scenarios. So you go back and you look for, oh, I remember when I worked with so-and-so, man, they always had me in anxiety. And what did you do? And how did you dodge that? So look at it with a more clear kind of lens as you now are informed with intentional responsibility. And then you might even think, associated with it, how that you went into a pro-depressive state, or you felt completely victimized and stuck as a result that you wouldn't take responsibility of your own emotional conditions. Then think about what would have happened if you had have entered into the empowerment circuit, the dopamine circuit, the responsibility circuit. Another exercise, these are just quick 3 stops. Stop blaming others. Every time you blame somebody, then tune into that. Oh, wow, I just blamed somebody. I am dodging responsibility. So consider every time you hear somebody blame somebody. Now, I don't encourage you to make them aware of it. That's not your role in their life. You're not their teacher, their corrector. You're not their mentor. But when somebody blames somebody else, just become aware of it. Oh, wow. What they're doing is they are dodging responsibility. And if they're not careful, they're going to end up in a pro-depressive state, and their biochemicals will keep them there. Even when it comes to this next stop making excuses. Whenever you hear yourself make an excuse or someone else make an excuse, all you're doing is you're building muscles and instincts for calling out this lack of responsibility or responsibility denial. Another thing is stop bemoaning your situation. And this again is clamor. It's where you are stirring drama up. Quit bemoaning your situation. So anytime you start bemoaning and you move from just sharing life with your spouse or sharing life with a team member and you're just, visiting and sharing, when you move from that and you begin to notice any anxiety that is creating for you drama, or when you share a bemoaning or drama scenario, slow down and begin to ask yourself, oh, wow, here is a gauge on the dashboard of my heart and soul, the dashboard of my brain. Here's a gauge, and it's telling me that this story I'm telling must have some anxiety behind it. And you begin to look for it and then take responsibility for that. And another exercise is write down the actions I can take right now. What can I do right now? Right now. What strategy can I make? And you might even ask this question of yourself, and probably should write it down. Write a list of things that you would self-advocate for if you were in no risk of offending others. Write a list of things that you would self-advocate for if you knew there was no risk of offending somebody. And then another one, learn the techniques and skills of boundary setting. Learn how to clarify that you do have a boundary. And this is a topic that we'll spend a lot more time on as we move forward. However, learn the techniques and skills of boundary setting. A lot of people set boundaries in a way where they just are anxious and saying, everybody stop doing what you're doing because I'm anxious. And then they say, nobody ever does nobody abides by my boundaries. Well, I just want you to know that is a complete misunderstanding of what a boundary is. And that again is where we're beginning with self-differentiation. And then I do want to say, you got to give some generous space for yourself to be imperfect and flawed. This is a critical part. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this as we get into the why of artsy, and that is you. But hold yourself with great grace and compassion and kindness, with radical acceptance, even in the context of your imperfection and flaws. So guys, this is our components. Component number 1 of self-differentiation is awareness. That's mindfulness. Number 2 is responsibility. That's what we dealt with today. It's where your limits are, and it's where your empowerment is. And then number 3, it is truth. We'll deal with that in next week's episode as we continue on. So that's all that we have for today. I hope you find all of these podcast episodes really helpful in all your life. I do want you to know we're creating wholehearted leaders through theology, psychology, and neuroscience. If you're a pastor and desire to do this work with your staff, I'd love to partner with you in the work. I am guest speaking on Sundays, as well as providing separate life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. I'd love to work with 6 to 10 of your whole staff and walk them through many of the things you're learning in this podcast. So reach out and we can customize our products and service packages to your context. You can reach me at Norris, Norris, Patrick, Patrick, @gmail.com. But you guys have an amazing week, and we'll see you next time.